Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Modjeska School of Human Rights. Today, of course, is March 7th, 2022. Today is the 57th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the Selma to Montgomery March that ended in tragedy. Also an important catalyst in the March to Voting Rights as well. And today's class is going to start with something a bit different. As you may recall, last week we began.
All right, now I can't hear anybody.
We began asking for. We can all hear you.
We can all hear you sighing and complaining.
All right. So last week we asked for volunteers to submit poem, song, whatever they wish to submit to start off our classes with participation from the audience. And of course, Becky Robbins is asking for folks to continually send in poems, songs, whatever they may have, to start the class off week to week. Because again, the Modjeska School doesn't work without your participation. Tonight, we do have a volunteer, Keitha Whitaker of Irmo. She has an excellent poem for us, so I'm going to turn the floor over to her right now to introduce that poem.
Okay. We moved back to South Carolina in 2011. I learned that actually a lot of my family came from here. And so this poem is about learning about some of the things about my family. It's called Back Home. Back home I've come, to the ancestral home, where my people stepped off the boat onto land and claimed it. They came to escape oppression, to live and worship freely, and became in turn oppressors with rules. One owned 2 men from Africa, a gift from an overlord. And so these immigrants took land that wasn't theirs, took food they hadn't grown, took seeds they hadn't gathered, and called this place their home. Over time, they migrated south, these immigrants of mine, to Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, and some stayed behind and lived in the Carolinas, and that's where I've returned. Here I bought land from immigrants, but was it theirs to sell? Now I buy food I haven't grown, buy seeds I haven't gathered, and call this place my home. What to do from here? This time, this place, this home. How best to make amends, atone for ancestral wrongs. We somehow must acknowledge that we live on stolen land. The ghosts of native and immigrant still clamor in our halls, still resound in the laws we wrote to establish our privileged place. Outdated laws ingrained in whiteness, in the ownership of land, patriarchy and white privilege still rule, control, abuse. Time to move toward new laws or new interpretations, to turn our old outdated systems toward a new reality where all laws serve all folks with life, liberty, and equity in all the realms that we inhabit in this time, this place, this home. Back home in South Carolina, where my ancestors disembarked, where I'll lay my ancestral head one day, and my descendants will look back. What will they say about these times? Will they have learned from our mistakes? Will the land of the free finally be home to everyone?
Thank you so much for that. That was a great and powerful poem, and one that I think we all needed to hear right now, especially. Thank you so much for that, Keitha Whitaker. That was excellent. And again, we want to encourage folks, if you have a poem or a song or anything in mind, please get in touch with Becky Robbins to let her know that you have something to open the class with. Because again, we want folks to participate in helping the class be the kind of class it can and should be.
And I just,
Keitha, if you'd like to share that, put your email in the chat so people can get it from you.
Yeah, we can do that. We'll send a link in the next class email. But I just wanted to remind Robert that he was going to do a hip hop rendition he offered last time.
I never really promised that. I said it was possible.
Tape. I'll roll the tape.
I mean,
that's all.
It's not happening tonight. Perhaps at some point. Perhaps. On that note, I now want to move along and really get us started with our main speaker for the evening. So, of course, with the Modjeska School, these last couple of class sessions, we focused a lot on the early origins of South Carolina, focusing mostly on the indigenous peoples last week, talking a little bit about European entry into what is now South Carolina. We're going to finish it up tonight. But to really understand South Carolina as a place, as an idea, as an integral part of the history of America and the Western world, we also have to take a look at peoples of African descent. And so this evening, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Burnette Gallman. For those who don't know, Dr. Gallman is a physician in Columbia. He's a member of the board of directors for the Modjeska Simpkin School of Human Rights. And he also serves on the national board of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. And he's given numerous classes and lectures on African history for 40 years. So tonight we're in for a wonderful treat as we'll all learn much more about various African civilizations and how those civilizations really, through the entry of enslaved Africans into South Carolina, how they really help to explain the state as it would become and as it is today. So Dr. Gallman, the floor is yours. Oh, by the way, one more thing before you start. For Q&A at the end of his talk, please make sure you place any questions you might have in the chat. That will help us to facilitate Q&A a bit faster, and also to help folks think about their questions a bit deeply before we actually ask them. So if you have any questions for Dr. Gallman, please put them in the Q&A during his talk. We'll get to those during the Q&A portion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greene. I am actually honored to be able to do this. It's going to be an overview because, you know, I couldn't possibly do justice to this topic in an hour. So let me fix my screen and get rid of some of this other stuff here. Okay. You know, everything gets back to CRT and the absurdities of the arguments against it. So I just thought we'd start off with some levity because the subject that I'm going to try to attack tonight is not funny at all. The illusory truth effect is a psychological manipulation that Goebbels, who was the chief propagandist for the Nazi Party, is given credit for it. And in essence, it says if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. So I'm going to highlight some of the lies that we have heard so much about African people. And I'm going to do the counterbalance with some truth. Not just US history has been whitewashed, it's been world history that's been whitewashed. So I want to start off with a couple of quotations from some very, very prominent and famous and well-respected historians. Arnold Toynbee said, "It will be seen that when we classify mankind by color, the only primary race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the Black race." That was in 1934. Almost 30 years later, Hugh Trevor Roper said, "Perhaps in the future there'll be some African history to teach, but at the present there is none. There's only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history." As Egyptologists and anthropologists, the Negro and Australian are more primitive than any other living peoples. And it goes on and on. I just picked those, but there are literally hundreds of such quotes. So I'm going to talk a bit about Egypt. That's the bulk of this. And first of all, the name Egypt was not the name given to it by the people who lived there. They called it Kemet. Much like many Europeans, when they invaded places, as was pointed out in the poem, one of the things they did was to rename things. There was a temple in Menepha called Huet-Ka-Ptah. Greeks couldn't pronounce it, they gave it the name Egyptos, and that has come down to us now. Although there were several other names, Tameri, the beloved land, Tawi, the united two lands, Mizraim. Those of you who may have been to Egypt can see in Arabic, Mizraim is Mizr. But the people who lived there for thousands of years called their land Kemet, the land of the blacks. Many people, so-called experts, claim that they would name their country after dirt. But Kim was the strongest word in that language for black, and T denotes a feminine gender, but it's also the written word in Meta-Neter or hieroglyphics. There's a piece of wood charred at both ends, and that's it. Let me see, where's the, oh, there it is. Racial myths about Kemet, the Hermitic hypothesis. And we're gonna revisit this too briefly. But in the Christian Bible, Ham was the middle child of Noah. Linguistically, H is equivalent to K in many languages, and vowels weren't used. So that would mean that Ham was equivalent to Chem, which I just mentioned was the strongest word in the Kemetic language for black. The sons of Ham, or Cam, were Ethiopia, Kemet, Canaan, and Libya. Hamites were known to be black until Napoleon rediscovered the grandeur. At that time, they became a branch of the white race. And the Hermitic hypothesis, and there are quite a few articles written on this, held that everything of value ever found in Africa was brought by Europeans. Then they came up with other racial myths, the brown race, the Mediterranean race. But talking about Africa, it's the largest continent and the second most populous. The median age in Africa is 19.7 years as compared to United States, which is 38.1, Europe 42, China 38, Japan 48, and South America 32. This is due to several factors. One is that people in Africa probably don't live as long as in those other places, but it also shows that there's a birth rate that is on the positive side. Anybody who looks at a map, the common Mercator map that has been standard, will get the impression that the United States is almost the size of Africa, but Africa's more than 3 times the size of the United States, and it's more than 2 million square miles larger than the continent of North America. Africa is the richest continent with the poorest people, and it's the birthplace not only of humanity, but also of civilization. The other thing that is important to understand that Africa contains 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 8% of the natural gas, 12% of the world's oil reserves. And I ran out of space to describe some of the other things that Africa has. When we talk about ancient Africa or Kemet, we know that education's always been important. Kemet, in this map, you look up in the northeast part, and ancient Kemet actually at any given time involved not only the area we now see as Egypt, but it involves part of Libya, part of Chad, part of Sudan, and part of Ethiopia. And depending on the time period, it may have also involved parts of Somalia. So who were these people and why are they so important? To quote one of my teachers, Dr. Asa Hilliard, the ancient Egyptians were Africans who created the world's oldest and most highly developed technical civilization in the history of humanity, from which flowed the civilizations throughout the rest of the world. I'm going to ask this question now, and hopefully in the Q&A we can talk about, discuss the answer. Was Cleopatra Black? I keep losing that, okay. Now these are two books that I recommend very highly that contains most of the information that I'm going to give you. Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Anthony T. Browder, and The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality by Sheikh Anta Diop. These are excellent references, and if you're interested in this topic at all, those are must-haves. Some other books that I think are equally important, Dr. Charles Finch, Echoes of the Old Dark Land, and Dr. Jacob Carruthers, Essays in Ancient Egyptian Studies. These give a little bit more information, especially about the cultural aspects. Black Man of the Nile, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen started taking people to Egypt on tours in the 1950s. Nile Valley Civilizations is a compendium of presentations that were given at a conference. I'm going to be referring to this man quite a bit, Sheikh Anta Diop. He was a multi-genius who did research which revolutionized history. He was the father of what we call chematology. I don't say Egyptology because Egyptology is a racist discipline. So he was the father of chematology. He was an expert in linguistics, nuclear physics, history, cultural anthropology, historiography, bone studies, and cranial studies. Now, how did he get to be an expert in all of that? He went to school in Paris at the Sorbonne. And when he was working on his PhD, he had to write 3 different documents to present for his PhD. They refused each one of those. So he chose something else. So he actually became expert in a lot of different things. The man to the right is someone else I'm going to be referring to, who's with Dr. Asa Hilliard, who I consider to be one of my teachers. Dr. Hilliard led study tours to Egypt until his death in 2000, in the year 2000. He had master keys to understanding Kemet. He lectures on this, and it can be found on YouTube if you just key in Asa Hilliard's master keys. And these are the things he says should be understood. The highlights are that the culture started before the country of Kemet was started. When you consider the fact that the calendar was in existence, usually the dates given for the creation of what we now call Egypt range between 3200 BCE and 4200 BCE. But whenever Egypt or Kemet came into existence, the calendar was already in existence. So in order to come up with a calendar, they had to have been observing the heavens for thousands of years in order to come up with a calendar. So the Kemetic culture remained intact through the 7th century. As we go through this lecture, you'll see that the older things are better. The orientation is up south because that had a lot to do with the flow of the Nile. The Nile River is one of the few rivers that flows from south to north, from up south to down north. So that the origin of the people and the culture is up south. The significance leaders were from the south. All the cultural creativities were indigenous. Invasions were destructive, except for the Greek and the Romans who imitated Kemetic culture. Science generated religion, philosophy, and culture. That's a topic I'm not going to get into at this point. The chronological period, one of the problems that I think is intentional is that whenever people talk about Egypt, they don't put it on the correct timeline. And they point to pictures of people from the Greco-Roman period. And that tends to be problematic because that was at the end. And finally, he says Egyptology is mainly the product of European scholars during the slavery, colonization, and racism period. I'm going to skip these. Diop, and this particular document is in your study materials, had several ways of proving that Kemet, the ancient Kemet people were Black. And it's interesting because he and one of his students, Dr. Theophile Obenga, who I've had the opportunity to speak with several times and hear him speak, he came up with something he called the melanin dosage test. And this is a simple test based on the fact that melanin, the pigment found in the skin between the dermis and epidermis, which makes us Black. And it's found in all tissues, actually, but it remains preserved even after embalming over many, many years. So if you take a piece of skin, expose it to a chemical called ethyl benzoate, then you can see the melanin granules and you can see how many they are and make a judgment as to whether the people are Black or white. What's interesting is they allowed him to do that on 1 or 2 mummies, and when they kept lighting up, they would not allow him to test any more of the mummies. He also used osteological measurements. I think this is probably one of the weaker things. He used blood groups, and he used the ABO, which I think was another fairly weak thing, but it would have been interesting to compare other antigen groups. The Diego antigen, which is found predominantly in Asians and Native Americans. The Duffy group, which is predominantly in people of African origin. The KEL is 100% in whites, but it's also found in 80% of Africans too. This is very important. The Kemites, says they saw themselves. As we mentioned, Kem means Black, and it means land. Now, I have seen this. This is an artist's rendition of a painting on the wall on the tomb of Ramses III from the 20th dynasty. And it's said to portray the known population of the world at the time. And so the significance is that they saw themselves as no different from men in other parts of Africa. So they saw them to the left, and the third, that's how they saw themselves and other Africans. Then the Indo-Europeans were the second, and the Semite, the people we now call Semites, were to the right. Witness of the Bible, we talked about the Ham story. Linguistic affinity. Diop showed that there was a genetic kinship between his language in Senegal, the language called Wolof, and the Kemetic language, Metanetia. Obenga did the same thing for his Central African language. And there's a cardiologist here in Colombia by the name of Solomon Chisoni, who actually did the same type of study between his language, Cabras, and the Metanetia. I've spoken with West African scholars from Ghana and from Nigeria who have done the same, and they've come up with additional evidence of linguistic affinity. Human images of the period, you're going to see that throughout this. Cultural data, circumcision, matrilineal inheritance, and divine epithets. Beneficial netures, which the Egyptologists call gods, but netures were just aspects of God, were always shown as black, while less positive netures are red. This is a picture of Asar, who the Greeks call Osiris. His title was Kemwir, which is the Great Black. The Kemites, according to the classical authors of antiquity. And I did a deep dive to come up with this, although I'm not going to be able to have time to share it. But everyone knows Herodotus, who was the father of history. It's always interesting how there are no mothers of history or of anything, but that's neither here nor there at this point. Herodotus traveled throughout Africa and the so-called Middle East and described what he saw. It's interesting that there are a lot of people now who disagree with his descriptions of what he saw. Some even going so far as to say he never went to Egypt. That always fascinates me. I want to read this. It is in fact manifest that the Colchians are Egyptian by race. Several Egyptians told me that in their opinion, the Colchians, now Colchis is an area in Russia, that the Colchians were descended from the soldiers of Sesostris. Sesostris was the name of a pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, I think. They call him Senwosret, his people call him. But he goes on to say, I had conjectured as much myself from 2 pointers. Firstly, because they have black skin and kinky hair. To tell the truth, he said that didn't prove anything because a lot of the people had kinky hair also. More reliably, the reason that alone among mankind, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians have practiced circumcision since time immemorial. These are some of the, this is a short list of classical writers who affirm the blackness of the Kemetic people. In another lecture, I actually looked up the actual quote, and there was no doubt in any of these people's mind. What's interesting is the last name on the bottom, Champollion Figeaud, who was the brother of Champollion, who actually translated the Rosetta Stone. Champollion Figeaud went so far as to say, it doesn't matter that the ancient Egyptians were dark-skinned, kinky-haired, big-lipped people, because they were just dark-skinned, kinky-haired, big-lipped white people, which gives you an idea of just how absurd some of those claims can be. I'm going to run through this. As I mentioned, pre-dynastic, the pre-dynastic area was the beginning of what we call Egyptian culture. And Nabda-Playa, which goes back 7,500 years BCE, which is almost 10,000 years now, is one of the earliest areas where we see intact culture that we now call Egyptian culture. And that's located in the Sahara. I won't say Sahara Desert because Sahara, the word Sahara means desert. So I'd be redundant when I say, if I were to say desert, desert. The Archaic Age. Oh no, I didn't mean to go that far. Okay. The Archaic Age were the first two dynasties. The historian Manetho actually is the first to put a timeline on these dynasties and tried to work them out. In periods of unrest, several dynasties may have existed at one time, but for the most part, it's very, very helpful in putting everything on a timeline. Dr. Hilliard was really big on that and actually came up with some very excellent timelines. The first two dynasties were called the Archaic Age. This is after the Upper Kemet, which is the south, defeated the Lower Kemet, which was the north, and they set up the capital at Menepher, which is now called Memphis. Don't know a lot about them, but they found some wigs. I took this picture in the Cairo Museum of some of the wigs. Again, some other books. I'm going to be introducing books throughout the lecture. These are proceedings from some of the conferences of the Association for the Study of Classical and African Civilizations. Kemet and the African Worldview is particularly excellent, as well as Reconstructing Kemetic Culture. These are lectures that were given by people who were expert. I love to show this because this is a photograph of a statue of the very first pharaoh that we know about in the very first dynasty. His name was Narma. The Greeks call him Menes. He looks like my Uncle Willie. He was the first. He was also somewhat of an engineer. He diverted the Nile, created the Delta, and built Memphis on land that had been drained. The first golden age, which is what Egyptologists call the Old Kingdom of the Pyramid Age, included the third through the sixth dynasties. It lasted about 500 years. How old is America? Oh, okay. Most of the pyramids that are still in existence in Egypt were built during this time, although there were many, many built during the 25th dynasty. We'll talk about that. Pharaoh Joseph of the third dynasty was important because he had as his I guess you would call him a physician. He was also the world's first multi-genius. Those of you who are familiar with Sir William Osler, who is revered in medicine today, Sir William Osler called him the first figure of a physician coming from the mists of antiquity. He was a multi-genius because he was a physician, sage, astronomer. He wrote books. He was an author. He was an architect and actually wrote, designed, and built the world's very first pyramid. He was the original upon which Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, was based. And the Hippocratic oath that physicians take was an oath to Asclepius. So actually, we're doing an oath to this man, Imhotep. This is the step pyramid at Saqqara. To give you an idea of how big it is, look to the right lower corner, and you'll see that that area that is pretty close to the level. This will give you an idea of just how massive this thing is. The Kemites were very, very spiritual people, so they did nothing without acknowledging something spiritually, so that there was a temple next to the step pyramid. I have a picture of the whole complex and I couldn't find it, and I apologize for that. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, was the president of the university, Ipet Isut. He came from very poor beginnings, but because he was so brilliant, he was able to advance his education. Pharaoh Khufu, the Greeks call him Cheops, but his mama called him Khufu, so that's what we're going to call him. Of the fourth dynasty, he built the Great Pyramid. This is a photograph of his statue. Speaking of the Great Pyramid, it was built about 2600 BCE with 2.5 million stones weighing an average of 2.5 tons each. Some as heavy as 70 tons, and some were moved from as far away as 500 miles without a scratch. It was 48 stories high, 481 feet, and it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for over almost 4,000 years. Contrary to popular belief, it took a long time to build, was not built by slave labor, and it was aligned with the stars. As a matter of fact, Anthony Browder, that first book that I showed you, who leads study tours to Egypt, Professor Browder is actually the first and only African-American to fund an archaeological dig in Egypt, which is ongoing today. He's named it after Asa Hilliard. He calls it the Asa Project. So if anybody has some money that they would like to donate, I would say if you Google the Asa Project and give some money, because it's certainly a worthy cause. Oh goodness, I'm going backwards. These are the pyramids. This is the Plains of Giza. And you know, I had to put me in there because I was very proud of that picture. Behind each of those pyramids, though, there were 3 smaller pyramids, especially behind the Great Pyramid, that was said to be dedicated to 3 women that were important to Khufu. One, his mother, and the other, 2 of his wives. Also behind the Great Pyramid is a museum holding a ship. They call it the Solar Bark, which Khufu was going to use to go to heaven. Khafre was his son and built the 2nd largest pyramid at Giza. Now, these are photographs of statues that are in existence. And these are the folk that Egyptologists say were white. This is just to show some faces, another 4th dynasty pharaoh. Ptahhotep is someone that I think is very, very important. He wrote the oldest book in existence from about 2,500 years BCE. And he wrote, it was what we call a wisdom text. Was able to visit his tomb. And this is the book. I recommend it. Baba Derek and I used to have a study group with teenagers, and we went through, we were studying this book, and the book only has maybe 40, 50 pages, but it took us a year to go through it. It was just that deep. I recommend it very highly. This is a 6th dynasty pharaoh, Pharaoh Pepi the First. He invaded deep in the Asiatic countries to their capitals in order to keep Kemet safe. One of the things that they did, they were not aggressive in the sense of the way that we think of aggression. They used, whenever anyone threatened them, they would invade the country and coexist with them so that they would keep their people safe. another Sixth Dynasty figure. These are images of the period. Between the first and second golden age, there was a period they call the first intermediate period. It was a period of civil unrest and civil war. I like to tell my politician friends that during this time, to be convicted of being a politician was grounds for the death penalty, because it was believed that in order to be an effective politician, you had to compromise truth. And the ancient Egyptians did not believe in compromising truth. The second golden age corresponded to what Egyptologists call the Middle Kingdom or the Literary Age, and included dynasties 11 and 12. It lasted about 260 years. And this is one of my favorite pharaohs from that. This Amenemhet III reigned for 47 years, and he was not only an excellent administrator, he was a builder. In case you didn't notice, what he was wearing on his head corresponds to what some people call dreadlocks. And if you didn't believe it, I took a picture from the back. Dreadlocks. These are some other Middle Kingdom heads. The second intermediate period occurred after the 12th dynasty, and it fell when a group of people identified only as Hyksos, shepherd kings, invaded Kemet. We don't know who they were. This period lasted about 160 years, but we do know that they created nothing and left nothing of worth to be there. The third golden age corresponded to what Egyptologists call the New Kingdom or Imperial Age, included dynasties 19. It lasted about 350 years, and it was founded after Hyksos were driven out. This is a photograph of a painting by Ahmose Nefertari, the mother of the 18th dynasty. This is her son, Amenemhet I. He was a builder. This was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut, who was a female pharaoh. Pharaoh was not a title reserved for a man like a title of king. A lot of people call her the queen, but she was the pharaoh. During her reign, she has reestablished trade routes that had been lost during the Hyksos, and sent a major trade expedition to Punt, which is probably present-day Somalia. She built a lot of things, but one thing in particular that she built was this temple that she built out of the side of a mountain.
20 minutes before questions, Dr. Gallman.
How many? How long?
20 minutes before you take questions.
Okay, thank you. Tutmosis III, 18th dynasty. During the period of his life, he was the most powerful person in the world. He ruled the world. This woman is Queen Tai, or some people call her T. She was the mother of two pharaohs, and as you can tell from her expression, she was nobody to be messed with. This was her grandson, King Tut, Tutankhamun. This was one of her sons, Amenhotep IV, frequently called Akhenaten or the Hermitic king. This is a bust when German archaeologists were looking through the ruins of Akhenaten's temple. They found this bust. And because it had on a royal headdress, they automatically called it Nefertiti. We only have that to go on, and that's the figure that most people recognize as being Nefertiti. However, a carving, and again, I have a lot of other pictures of the way that the ancient Kemites portrayed Nefertiti, but this is their depiction of Nefertiti. So I don't know who that other woman was, but this is who they call Nefertiti. Pharaoh Seti IV, first of the 19th dynasty, the father of Ramses the Great. This was the mother of Ramses the Great. Fourth golden age, the 25th dynasty, called the Nubian dynasty. The revival age, because they actually came back during the latter part of the 18th dynasty, the 19th and 20th dynasty. There was a lot of intermarriage, so that they were getting away from the Africanness of Kemet. So they came and they called it the revival age. It's the only dynasty that Egyptologists agree had Black pharaohs. And as a matter of fact, Arthur Weigall called it that infernal inward dynasty. This is one of the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. He's actually mentioned in the Bible. He ruled for more than 26 years. And he constructed a lot of pyramids, many of which are in Somalia. As a matter of fact, in Sudan, I'm sorry. And as a matter of fact, there are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. Kemet's contributions to the world. I'm going to go through some of those. Architecture, the Horem Market, the Sphinx. Evidence suggests that it's much older than 10,000 years old. The face was believed to have been destroyed by Napoleon's cannons, although some chematologists don't. My friend, the late Runoko Rashidi, doesn't believe that to be the case. But Baron Denon, who was a scientist who went with Napoleon into Egypt, drew a picture of it before it was destroyed. Tekken, also called obelisk, and I wish I had time to tell you the significance of these. The Kemites made Tekken from a single piece of granite. And if there was a fault, they were so perfectionist. This is what they call the unfinished Tekken. The Washington Monument, on the other side, on the other end, was made with 36,000 blocks of granite. This is an area at a temple called Ipeti Sut reflecting pool with the Tekken in the distance. Does that look familiar? We know that they were the first to write. We know about Metanetra, which the Greeks call hieroglyphics, but they had two other types of writing, hieratic and demotic. The educational system was called a mystery system. And for thousands of years, nobody was allowed to come in. And then I guess around 600 or 800 BCE, they allowed some Greeks to come in and be educated. So I guess the Greeks were the very first affirmative action students. Plutarch stated that the wisest of the Greeks studied in Kemet, Solon, Thales, Plato, Eudoxus, and Lycurgus. Sir Isaac Newton said Pythagoras studied in Kemet for 22 years. None of those people stayed for the 42 years that was the total course of study. So I guess you could say they were also the first dropouts. Kemetic medicine is specialized, socialized, non-sexist, and they had high standards. There are a lot of medical textbooks in existence. This is a short list. There were 4 types of physicians, and some of them weren't considered to be physicians, but you had physicians like internal medicine doctors. You had surgeons, orthopedists, obstetricians. Mathematics, the so-called discoveries of Pythagoras were documented on Kemetic papyri hundreds of years before Pythagoras was born. The Berlin Papyrus has quadratic equations. The first known multiplication table is the Shango bone found 20,000 years dated 20,000 years ago, found along the Nile. The Rhine papyrus contained first-degree algebraic equations, fractions, and geometry. The Moscow papyrus contained geometric problems. In religion, the original trinities were not Father, Son, and a masculine Holy Ghost. The original trinities were a family, mother, father, and child. The first Madonna and child was Aset and Heru, who the Greeks call Isis and Horus. Philosophy, ethics, development of the calendar, metallurgy, shipbuilding, so forth and so on. Oh, I could give a whole lecture on these next two slides, the judgment, but I don't have time. In exploring, Dr. Ivan van Sertima, in his book, They Came Before Columbus, revealed compelling botanical, anthropological, archaeological evidence and iconic evidence suggesting that the Olmec civilization of Central and North America was either African or strongly influenced by African. This is an Olmec head that people deny has anything to do with Africans. Dr. Van Sertima said that the helmets that these heads wore were corresponding to helmets worn in Kemet during the 25th dynasty. So we go back to Arnold Toynbee. It'll be seen when we classify mankind by color, the only primary race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the Black race. So I'm going to go through these really quickly. More reading, Egypt Revisited by Van Sertima and Egyptile of Africa by Van Sertima. The question was Cleopatra Black. The answer is it don't matter because when she came along, everything of worth had been done. But let's go to West Africa. There was a West African golden age from the 14th to the 17th century. Chancellor Williams, a South Carolina native and a Howard University professor who was the author of the book that I'm going to show you in a minute, said the first and most important fact is that the general enslavement of Africans proclaimed to the world as savages began during the very period and in the very West Africa, the center of which held one of the great universities of the world and other colleges. These are some excellent books about about Africa and African civilizations. This is also good reading. This golden age was the early phase of the Ma'afa, or the African Holocaust, and it was cut short by enslavement. During this period of time, there were universities with medical and law schools in West Africa, and students from all over the world came to study there. As a matter of fact, in Timbuktu, in Mali, they had a university called the University of Sankore, which had a scholar by the name of Ahmed Baba, who wrote more than 40 books on multiple topics. During this period of time when Africans were being kidnapped and brought here to be enslaved, very often many of those enslaved Africans were not only better educated than their enslavers, but were probably more intelligent than their enslavers. Jenny, a city in Mali, had a university that trained surgeons who regularly removed cataracts from the human eye in the 1470s. In Islamic Africa, when Islam took over, the Arabs invaded Africa through Egypt in the 640s ACE, and they benefited from that knowledge and they played it forward so that in 711, when these Moors invaded the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and southern France, they brought this knowledge with them and they created huge institutions of learning in Spain and Portugal, and lasted until they were driven out of Spain in 1492 by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. They created many medical colleges, and graduates in medicine had to pass an exam given by the faculty. And Professor John G. Jackson, who is also a South Carolina native, in his book says that the Moors actually lifted Europe out of the so-called Dark Ages. I'm gonna skip this. So this has been a brief overview. There are about 5 or 6 of these slides that I could give a 2-hour lecture on, but there's a wealth of information available about how Africa has positively influenced the development of Western civilization, even though some of the Western interpretations have been negative. I have more references available on request. I want to do a shameless plug for the books that I've written. And I'm going to stop now and let's do some questions. Did I do it right?
Dr. Gallman, let me say that I want to go to the 2-hour class, and that people that want your book can respond, and we'll make sure they get one. But that I'm willing to volunteer Dr. Gallman. I'm sure he will rise to the occasion. For people that want a special class on this, put something in the chat. We'll set up something. We'll advertise it, and there can be a special segment on this early African history that Dr. Gallman so puts the fire under. Thank you, Doctor. Robert?
Thank you.
Yes. And again, that was a wonderful presentation, Dr. Gallman, always informative, and I think really humbling. Think about the histories of Africa that so many folks still need to know in this day and age. So that was wonderful. And again, Dr. Gallman himself said he's only scratching the surface. So, there's so much more to be said there. Speaking of which, there are a few questions in the chat. I want to start with those right away. So Baba Derek had a couple of questions. One was, what's a golden age? Like, you used that term golden age several times. What's a golden age, and how many golden ages did Kemet create?
Kemet created, now the term golden age was actually used in reference to Kemet by Dr. Asa Hilliard. And that was a time when the civilization was thriving and creativity was flourishing, and they were building and they were writing. In the Middle Kingdom, they wrote so many, they used to write on everything. They would write on walls, they'd write on furniture. And many of those writings have come down to us as text. You have the coffin text, the pyramid text, so that the 4 golden ages of Kemet were defined by Dr. Asa Hilliard.
All right, and Baba Derek also had a follow-up question in the chat as well. Can you explain why only leadership is recognized in Egyptology and not what the people appear to be?
You want to start something? The people who actually originally wrote the book, and again, like I said, that this was only scratching the surface and looking from the top down. The people who actually did some of the original work, even though incorrect, would only recognize rulership. The thing is that the whole idea of rulership in Kemet was totally alien to the Europeans who initially wrote about it, because there was the idea of the servant leader. And this is something that it was extended into Africa. There was a model from, I want to say Ethiopia, who actually, she was a supermodel for a while, but she went back to her, I want to say her name was Elizabeth, but she went back to her country because it was her time to come to power. And I say, and again, I don't like to use that term. It was her turn to assume the leadership role. Whereas in the Western concept of rulership, is power, it is influence. In ancient Africa, and actually in the period of Africa during the West African Golden Ages, the leadership was more consensus driven. You had councils of elders, and you had representatives from families that would all get together and make decisions by consensus to influence the whole group. Any questions? Any other questions?
A couple from Don Murphy, as a matter of fact. One is, what was the life expectancy at that time? 42 years seems like a long time to study. Even 22 years seems like a long time to be educated.
You know, Brother Murphy, I looked at that, and that was, I've never been able to answer that question to my satisfaction. The 42-year number comes from a book that I didn't feature, but I should have, called Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James, who actually did some tremendously in-depth study. The life expectancy during that period of time was probably more like 50, 60 years, because education began in long before it does here. It began in around 2 or 3 years old. And as was outlined, you had some pharaohs who actually ruled for as long as 65 years. So even though I can't give you a number in terms of the life expectancy, I suspect that it was substantial. And if I were to give the lecture on the African origin of medical science, you can kind of see that they were very sophisticated, not by our standards, but they were sophisticated in terms of the way that they practice medicine.
All right. And another question from Don Murphy. This is a really intriguing question. What is the history of South Africa as far as contributions to the world? It is the cradle of civilization, I believe.
I don't know the answer to that. I know that there's a lot of research going on Great Zimbabwe, which is, and I have to admit that I am just now starting to study that. South Africa, we don't hear much. And I remember probably about 20, 25 years ago, University of South Carolina had a summer program in which they would bring teachers from South Africa to kind of an exchange program. And we had a chance, our study group had a chance to interact with them. And what they said was that their history was totally erased, to the extent that, in fact, one of the leaders of that delegation was a woman whose name escapes me now, who was doing all she could to travel around the country to recapture some of the history by talking to some of the elderly people, because their history had been completely wiped out by the creators of apartheid. So it's like there's a quote in the Kemetic literature. Someone asked about the people of Sumer, who they used to call the Blackheads. So what happened to the Blackheads? And said they lost their history, so they died. And I don't know whether or not any South African history has been recovered, but that's certainly worth looking up. And that is a project that I intend to look at, because they're finding so many archaeological discoveries in Southern Africa that I think will be profoundly important.
Right, that's deeply fascinating. Now, here's another question. This one is from Daniel. This is a rather interesting question. Amenhotep IV's political religious revolution, centered around the worship of a ten, has been asserted as establishing monotheism. Do you agree with this claim?
Nope, I do not. The ancient Kemites believed in one great God who we consider nature. They worship the creator's creations. And they felt that God, much like, and a lot of this was passed on, because if you look at Ifa, the Yoruba religion, Candomblé, if you look at Voodoo, what happens is that they see one great God, but God is so great that you really, a mere man cannot comprehend God, so that they have aspects of God. For instance, one of my favorite aspects of God was Ma'at, who is the female wisdom aspect of God. And Ma'at, and one of the things that they also did was they did not have opposite sex. They had complementary sex. They had twinships, so that each nature, and I can't prove this, but I really believe that our word nature comes from that, from nature. I really believe that the male aspect, wisdom aspect of God was Jehudi, and Ma'at was the female wisdom aspect. And between the two of them, Ma'at had 7 principles that formed the order of the culture. And those principles were truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, order, and reciprocity. Now, obviously they were human. The ancient Egyptians were human. I don't want to make them out to be some super duper people. They were human, and they had all the foibles of humanity. But at the same time, even though they weren't perfect, they were as perfect, if not more perfect, than any subsequent civilization. Picture a world where everyone makes an attempt to tell the truth all the time. Picture a world where everyone believes in justice and fairness and order. So getting back to Akhenaten actually wasn't his father actually was the first to revere the Aten, Amenhotep III. And if you read stories of his life, of Akhenaten's life, he was influenced by his father, because when he was a child, they would travel in a ship on the Nile, the family, and he would make hymns. His father would worship the Aten, the sun disk. And it's interesting because one of the things in Tony Browder's book is he draws parallels between some of the writings that have been ascribed to Akhenaten compared to passages in the Bible. And we know that Akhenaten came long before the Bible. And if you look at one of the things I wasn't able to say when on those slides about the judgment, when someone died, they had to go before the ancestors and the netchers to be judged, and their heart had to be judged against a feather. The feather was the symbol of Ma'at. So they had the scale, which is where we get those legal scales from. They had the scales where the person's heart was on one side and the feather of Ma'at was on the other. And if the heart was as light as a feather, the sun guided the deceased soul to the father. Heru, no one can get to the Father but through the Son, for Christians who might recognize that. And it all comes from ancient Kemet. And there were 42 affirmations of innocence that the deceased person had to be able to say. 10 of those have come to us as the 10 Commandments. You know, I guess it's kind of hard to live by 42.
All right. Another very quick question in chat. I can actually take this one. Will we be able to listen to this class session at a later time in our day with the questions asked and answered? Yes, there will be recordings of this session posted later on. The classes are always recorded and then posted later on online to watch as well. So if you want to come back and watch the session, you're more than welcome to do so. Dr. Frank Martin has an interesting question in the chat. Was life expectancy stratified by class, with priests and the upper or wealthy classes living off of 80 years, but the average worker only expected to live to age 35 or 40?
That depends on the era. During the early era, during the Archaic Age and in the Old Kingdom leading up to the First Intermediate Period, one of the problems was the stratification of social class. And that is when the identity of the Pharaoh as servant leader rather than descendant of God on earth that was all omnipotent ceased to exist. So in the history of Kemet, yes, that was the case. Toward the middle part, again, a lot of it had to do with what type of work was done. Obviously, if your work was dangerous and required youth, then that would decrease the life expectancy and the average life expectancy. Toward the end of Egypt, it's ironic that the Greeks and the Romans, the Assyrians and the Hittites who initially invaded Egypt were destructive. When the Greeks invaded, one of the things that Dr. John Henry Clark used to teach us is that when the Greeks invaded, the ancient Egyptians, the Kemites, were so weary of invasions that they were happy that there was going to be an invader who would be kind and benevolent. And indeed, the Greeks became imitative. I think Cleopatra VII was the last ruler, and that's the Cleopatra that Elizabeth Taylor made famous. So depending on who you read, again, I'm straying off a little bit. Depending on who you read, Cleopatra VII may have had some African ancestry. But even if not, again, it doesn't really matter because she was at the end. So I hope that answered your question in a roundabout way, Dr. Martin.
Dr. Greene, if I may interrupt Dr. Gallman and say that we need to segue into the European invasion, but you are backed by popular demand, sir, and I will, there are a number of people that have said, will you do something special to carry this on in another setting? And I'll get with you in a date and we'll post it and share it with people.
Okay.
Because it's a tremendous need for us to understand that which it is that was stolen from the people, that we don't start off with the way we were taught in South Carolina schools. Dr. Greene, you're supposed to now bring in the invaders.
All right. So on that cheerful note from Brett, once again, thank you so much, Dr. Gallman, for a great presentation this evening. And I actually want to start off my part of the presentation about South Carolina in the 18th century by actually reading a portion of W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk. I read this to my class earlier today, and this is really more about what we're doing at the Modjeska School. And after hearing Dr. Gallman, I felt I had to read this right now to the rest of the class. Du Bois wrote, "The function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning or to furnish teachers for the public schools or to be a center of polite society. It is above all to be the organ of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, an adjustment which forms the secret of civilization." And I would say that I think Dr. Gallman's presentation is a reminder of why it's so important to embrace lifelong learning, to embrace lifelong education, and to be aware of the fact that there have been so many peoples in world history, like the people that he spoke of this evening, who fully embrace that kind of educational model. All of that is to say that I really wanted to start tonight's presentation on a positive note, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so is really about conquest. It's really about political discord. In short, South Carolina in a nutshell. So let me go ahead. Daniel, let me get some screen sharing privileges just for a quick second. I do want to show folks a few things. Number one, thank you. I want to start off with where we ended last week. As you may recall, last week we were talking a bit about the Stoner Rebellion of 1739 and how it leads to the Negro Act of 1740, which really restricted the movement of enslaved Africans in South Carolina, prohibited their learning to read or write, made it illegal for them to raise money, to raise food, which is something we're going to talk about with our event this coming Sunday, but I'll talk about that in class this evening. And it stayed in force until 1865. But what you really want to think about here, and I can't help but also add a bit of commentary about the fact that thinking about the prohibition of teaching enslaved Africans how to read or write sounds particularly painful now after Dr. Gallman's presentation, when you realize just how much was lost, not only for Africa, but also how much was lost in the Americas, that so many men and women were not allowed to learn, to read, to write. But South Carolina in the 18th century, as it is coming into its own as a colony built on enslavement on the one hand and on the conquest of native lands on the other, is also starting to take on an integral role in the Atlantic world, in the Atlantic economy, in trade, in commerce, and in the intellectual world of the Atlantic as well. And that's where I want to segue to right now. Now, one thing about South Carolina is that most of us who are from the state or have lived there for a long time are aware of the various regions of South Carolina, right? Think about the Low Country, the Midlands, the PD, the Upstate. But what you want to also think about is how the state of South Carolina and its history is partly shaped by this geography. So, as we already know, most folks coming to South Carolina in the 17th and 18th centuries, they are initially coming in, whether by choice as colonists or by force as enslaved Africans. They're coming in via Charleston, via the Low Country. But there is going to be a certain point in the 18th century where that's going to change dramatically, and where you're going to see more movement by both white and African settlers into what we call the Midlands, and later on, of course, the Upstate. As an example, you start to see in the 1750s and 60s more movement of white South Carolinians into what we now call the Midlands, mainly because of two things. Number one, economic competition with slaveholders in the Low Country. It makes it very difficult for them to earn a living when they're going up against plantation owners who have access to enslaved labor. This was actually a major problem across all of the British North American colonies in the 18th century. In New York, for example, there was long a long concern about enslaved labor competing against white settlers in New York, and especially against white farmers and white professional workers in New York City in the 1730s and 40s. And actually sparked what was called the New York Slave Conspiracy of 1739, again, right around the same time as Stoner Rebellion, where there are fears and concerns raised of potential slave revolt in New York as well. So one reason for that movement into the Midlands is economic competition. Another is military strategy. The governor of South Carolina at the time is deeply concerned, Robert Johnson is deeply concerned about the Cherokee Nation, which resides in neighboring Georgia. And so he's encouraging settlers to go into the Midlands to live there, to essentially live as a buffer between the low country elite and the Cherokee Nation to their east and northeast. Now, I think we're all aware of one of the, perhaps the greatest irony of American history, which is how a nation founded on the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality for all included many men who were also slaveholders, slave owners, or traders in slaves, one of those being South Carolina's own Henry Lawrence. Now, Henry Lawrence is a figure I want to talk about briefly because he symbolizes these contradictions, right? He was a leading citizen of South Carolina. He was a lawyer. He had a lot of prominent roles. After the Revolutionary War, he's actually one of the negotiators in Paris for the Treaty of Paris that formally ends the conflict. During the Revolutionary War, he serves as the president of the Congress after John Hancock. But before the Revolutionary War, the 1750s, Lawrence makes a ton of money as a slave trader. He's actually part of a slave holding firm in Charleston that during the 1750s oversees the sale of over 8,000 enslaved Africans. Again, making Lawrence a lot of money. Most of his fortune comes from the slave trade, which in the 18th century is becoming an increasingly lucrative trade for the British, for the French, for the Spanish, for the Portuguese, for everyone involved in European colonization of the Americas. But Henry Lawrence really represents what this looks like on the ground in South Carolina. And so that growth of the slave trade is a key engine of Carolina's growth in the 18th century. But again, as I pointed out before, it would be a mistake to assume that white South Carolina is fully 100% unified on all issues. Of course, white South Carolina is completely united on the issue of upholding slavery and indeed of keeping the enslaved Africans in line, quote unquote, as much as possible. Again, in support of the Negro Act in 1740, the fact that South Carolina itself, really until the end of the Civil War, is a state, like most other Southern states, that its politics, its economy, its social life, everything is shaped by constant fears of a slave revolt. However, and I think this is an especially important point for the Modjeska School, for students who are interested in activism. Within white South Carolina, there are some serious class divisions and class tensions that arise partly as a result of competition between the plantation elite, the slaveholding elite, the low country, and the so-called independent or yeoman farmers of South Carolina. Now, by the 1760s, you're starting to see more and more division amongst white Americans across what will become known as the United States. Of course, 1760s is the era of resistance to the Stamp Act, era of resistance to Townshend Acts, an era where you start seeing the idea of no taxation without representation. But in South Carolina, from 1767 to 1769, we have what is called the Regulator Movement. You have a version of it in North Carolina that's actually much larger, much better known. But in South Carolina, the Regulator Movement was essentially fueled by this movement of white South Carolinians into the interior of South Carolina. So let me explain. Most of the folks who become involved in this movement from 1767 to 1769 are farmers. They're independent farmers. They're what we call yeoman farmers. And as they're moving deeper into the interior of South Carolina, what they find is that the government of South Carolina, based out of Charleston, isn't really providing law enforcement, isn't providing schooling for their children. In short, there's no government infrastructure to support this movement into what we now call the Midlands. Now, this may not seem like that big of a deal, except for the fact that for many of the regulators, what they were concerned about was without law enforcement, they fell prey to what they call hunters, people who were living off the land, may take some of their cattle, some of their crops, etc. It felt like a lawless environment for many of the folks who become involved in the regulator movement. But perhaps more importantly, this movement also gains importance in the history of South Carolina because many of the regulators also argue that the government of Great Britain, which is based in London, also showed that it did not really care about the plight of farmers who were trying to make a living off the land. And so what you see here in the regulator movement is a combination of concerns over competition with slave labor, concerns over Britain's lack of concern about their colonies, and within South Carolina itself, a decided bitterness towards the low country elite in Charleston and the low country. This is, again, one of the key dividing lines in South Carolina's history, this divide between the low country elite and the rest of the state. It really begins in the colonial period. And I will be remiss if I didn't mention that one of the regulators was Patrick Calhoun, a man who had immigrated with his parents from Ireland to Virginia earlier in the 18th century. By the 1760s, he's living in South Carolina, and he becomes part of this regulator movement. Today, of course, Patrick Calhoun is probably best known as the father of John C. Calhoun, a gentleman who may get a mention or two in this class in the next few weeks, just FYI. Now, what you see here is actually a map of South Carolina's various districts in 1769. And I include this because I want to give you a sense of how what we now know as South Carolina is starting to slowly grow further and further inland. And if you look at the map, you look at the center of it, for instance, there is no Columbia, South Carolina. That will come along a bit later. But you also look, if you look in what's now the upstate, right? You look at the blue that's on the map. A lot of that is areas of South Carolina had very little settlement from Europeans. In fact, some of it was still considered to be lands that belonged to the Cherokee. If you look at the Midlands, you see Orangeburg District, you see Camden District, and then further north, you see 96th District. But this gives you a sense of how the regulators were able to push the colonial government to create districts that would allow for the implementation of schooling, to allow the sending of sheriffs into the area, that sort of thing. So keep in mind, though, that most of the wealth and most of the political power in South Carolina is still very much based along the coastline, in and around Charleston. It's going to be a while before that changes, but this is a political and cultural cleavage within South Carolina that we should be aware of right now. We should be thinking about as we go forward. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, of course, during the 1760s and early 1770s, there's this minor matter amongst the 13 colonies of considerable political consternation with Great Britain over taxation, over the expansion of territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains. For those who don't know, in 1763, the British government signs a treaty with various indigenous peoples in what we now call being called the West, in the present day Midwest, basically saying we're going to create a proclamation fund. That's the Appalachian Mountains. Beyond that point, the British promised they would not allow any American settlers to go west of that line. And so, of course, Americans, being who they were, even in the 1760s and 70s, violated that particular line and really wanted to expand westward. This actually becomes one of the key dividing lines between Americans on the one hand and the British on the other. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. Part of it is that some of the most prominent Americans, like George Washington, also worked as land speculators. They were surveyors. They actually purchased land out west and owned it to kind of speculate on it as earning more money over time. And they felt the British were impeding on that particular business. In addition to that, you do have concerns amongst some, I want to emphasize some, not all, but some Southern colonists over the institution of slavery within the British Empire. You start seeing the earliest rumblings of the abolitionist movement on both sides of the Atlantic during the 1770s. And there are some in the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, Maryland, who are deeply concerned that in the long run, the British government may not actually defend slavery the way they would want it to be defended. Now, this has come up with the 1619 Project and arguments over the importance of slavery to the cause of the Revolutionary War. I do want to make it clear that it is a factor for some in deciding for independence, but other factors like land speculation, taxation, representation, all of these come together to push the American colonies in 1775 to start taking up arms against the British in the following year to formally declare independence in 1776. But I think one element of this that's incredibly important is how the Revolutionary War is a period of upheaval across British North America, and especially in the Southern colonies. A big part of this upheaval is, of course, concern about slavery and concern about keeping the enslaved Africans in line and keeping them under control. Now, of course, as we've already talked about, as we'll learn more about in the weeks to come, enslaved Africans were always resisting their enslavement. They were resisting it daily, hourly, trying to find different ways to really preserve their well-being, preserve themselves as people, even in the face of terrible circumstances. But there were two periods in the history of the United States where slavery was perhaps at its closest to its breaking point in terms of severe national upheaval. One being the American Civil War, which we'll talk about pretty soon, and the other being the Revolutionary War. Now, in November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia, issues what's known as Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, where he offers to any enslaved African who makes it to British lines and agrees to serve the British government as a soldier, he offers them their freedom. And for some American colonists, this was proof positive that the British really had no dedication to slavery, defending it. Never mind the fact that the British were making a lot of money off their colonies in Barbados, Bermuda, and especially Jamaica. But in the United States, what we become known as the United States, Lord Dunmore's Proclamation serves as just one of many points during the Revolutionary War where the institution of slavery itself is under siege throughout the South. By the time the Revolutionary War comes to an end in 1783, over 100,000 enslaved Africans had made it to freedom in some form or fashion out of approximately 500,000 enslaved Africans across the 13 colonies. In South Carolina alone, over 25,000 enslaved people make it to British lines during the Revolutionary War. Now, South Carolina, for those who may not be aware, was one of the principal battlegrounds of the Revolution. In fact, there were more battles fought in South Carolina, 137, than there were in any other colony during the war. And that spans from 1775, some small skirmishes here and there, to the siege of Charleston in 1780, really up until the end of the war itself. And in South Carolina, the war is not quite what we see in most of these paintings. You know, in most paintings of the Revolution, you see images of continental soldiers in blue fighting redcoats and these big sprawling fields. In South Carolina, the war was a bit different. Part of it was you had Americans fighting Americans, loyalists versus patriots, over and over again. You had use of guerrilla warfare, Francis Marion, for example. And then you also had the ever-present concern of a slave revolt in South Carolina. And this really, again, governs how the state handles the revolution. Again, you have actually many Black soldiers fighting for the British during the war, tens of thousands. While in the Continental Army, you also have eventually thousands of Black soldiers serving for them as well. Now, during the Revolution, you do have various leaders out of South Carolina, like Christopher Gadsden, who's delegate to the Stamp Congress in the 1760s. He actually designs the "Don't Tread on Me" flag that was used in 1775. And to be totally blunt, I wish somebody had stopped him, because I'm sick and tired of seeing that flag everywhere these days in local discourse. But I digress. What is important to note is that "Don't Tread on Me" flag was designed by a South Carolinian. Considering how often I see it on the roads here in South Carolina, I can't help but find that a bit ironic. But then you have folks like John Rutledge, who again is a representation of how so much of South Carolina's history is tied to slavery in one form or fashion. Now, Rutledge was a governor of the state during the Revolutionary War. He's a brother to Edward Rutledge. But before the war, he was actually a lawyer who at times actually even defended people who were accused of mistreating their slaves, accused of physically assaulting them and the like. He defended these folks on several occasions. Or you take someone like William Henry Drake, who was actually supportive of Great Britain up until 1774. He was actually serving on the Colonial Council, which governed 13 colonies, and then he was thrown out after he made it clear he supported the Patriot cause. Now, during the Revolutionary War, he was a delegate to the Continental Congress. He is very active in the politics of the state, but he also had some rather interesting views on indigenous peoples. And I want to read this quote from him slowly. He said during the Revolution, he said, quote, "Cut up every Indian cornfield and burn every Indian town, till their nation can be extirpated and the lands become property of the public," end quote. And so Drayton is also a representation of how South Carolina is still playing an important role in westward expansion in trying to pursue lands out west, trying to confiscate more lands from the indigenous peoples. During the Revolutionary War, for example, various indigenous tribes choose different sides, some allied with the Americans, quite a few, like the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee Nation, actually allied with the British during the war, because they put it in a modern saying, "The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know." Well, the indigenous people knew both devils, so to speak, and they knew that the British, as bad as they were at least more willing to negotiate than they felt the Americans were. Now, what's also interesting is that in South Carolina, again, as I mentioned before, there is a serious divide between Loyalist forces and American Patriot forces during the war. Quite a few of the Loyalists had actually only lived in the state roughly up to 15 years. Many of them had moved there fairly recently. But what you also see in South Carolina is burgeoning support for what's called the Articles of Confederation. Now, when we talk about the Constitution and the problems that the Palmetto State had with the Constitution, this will seem especially ironic. But South Carolina becomes the first state to actually approve the Articles of Confederation in 1778. We often think of the Articles as being the document that in the 1780s, the scientific way of putting it, kind of sucked, at least for many American elites who wanted a more stronger, more direct federal government. But during the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation was the first document that really bound the colonies together during the war. It gave them an actual governing structure and the like. And South Carolina was really supportive of that. Now, that same year, the first formal state constitution is approved. Before that, of course, South Carolina was a colony of Great Britain. It was a colony that was built on slavery. But after this, it formalized its role as a state, as part of the 13 colonies, the 13 United States, fighting in the latter years of the Revolutionary War. But what's most important about the Palmetto State during the Revolutionary period is that it is a state that sees a lot of social and political upheaval. Again, 25,000 enslaved people escaping from slavery during the war. Literally over 100 battles fought in the state, often between residents of the state. South Carolina emerges from the Revolution more determined than ever before to make sure it can keep order and stability, whatever the cost. And if that order comes to the expense of the enslaved, so be it. And if that order comes at the cost of independent farmers moving further inland during and after the war, so be it as well. But this really marks a turning point for South Carolina. It's a state that, after the Revolutionary War is over with, is going to become more and more dedicated to the idea that slavery is at the heart, center of its identity as a state and as a place of resistance after the Revolutionary War. Okay. So that's really what I have this evening in terms of that early European expansion in South Carolina. Again, I do want to go back briefly to that map of the state in 1769, and I think it's incredibly fascinating. But I also wanted to see if there were any questions in the time we have left. Okay, so I do see, okay, why do we, okay, so let's see a few questions right here in the chat. Why do we hear about the Low Country, Midlands, and the Upstate Piedmont and not the PD? You know, that's actually a really good question. If I were to venture a guess, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on PD, but my guess would be that the other parts of the state carry huge historic significance. Of course, the Low Country being the home of Charleston, being the first place settled by the British. The Midlands really coming into its own in the 19th century, having the capital of Columbia and the like, and the upstate Piedmont being a hotbed of local activity in the 19th and 20th centuries. But in terms of why the PD gets ignored, you know, that I'm not really sure. Brett, do you have a
Robert? Starting in the 70s, it was referred to as behind the pine curtain. And the best I can figure is it didn't have good dirt until the tobacco industry. And that's my best shot at it, my friend.
Okay. Well, you know, again, that's a really intriguing question. I might actually look into that some more because I'm wondering the same thing. Why is the PD kind of overlooked like that? Another good question in the chat here, and I should know this is coming since I mentioned the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. This is from Katie Crosby. I'm confused by the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. That makes all of us. In the West Wing, Sam had it in his office. Now it is widely used by conservatives. What changed? That's a really good question, and I could spend the whole night talking about conservative iconography. But to make a long story short, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag is one of those symbols that has been appropriated by the conservative right in the U.S. To link them back to the Revolutionary era, to make a case for them as being the real inheritors of America and the ideals of America. And you see this happen with the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. I think a big part of this was actually during the beginnings of the Tea Party, for example, in 2009-10. You began to see the Tea Party especially using a lot of iconography from the Revolutionary era, like the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the outfits from the Revolutionary era. They began to wear their rallies, those, tri-corner hats, et cetera. They wear those rallies. I think that's really what happened, that conservatives, especially those involved in the Tea Party, began to latch on to that symbol because they thought it was a useful symbol and it linked them to the Revolutionary era, kind of saying again that we are the true inheritors of this legacy of America. Let's see. Okay. Baba Derek has a good question. How important is keeping an accurate timeline when it comes to studying history? Well, that's actually a far more tricky question than you might think. I mean, I say that for the reason of teaching pedagogy on a college level. We often tell our students that in a college history level course, we aren't quite as concerned, say, with dates or like having to knowing the exact date of something as we are having like a general sense of the year, time period which an event took place. But timelines are important in terms of keeping everything together, of understanding cause and effect. When you think about history as whether as a liberal art or a social science or what have you, you want to think of it not simply as events that occurred in the past, but you want to think of it as why did these events occur when they occurred. So to give you an example, later in the Modjeska school, we're going to get into talking about ideas of civil rights versus human rights in the 20th century and how that influences folks like Modjeska Simpkins and others in South Carolina and the kinds of activism they take up. But to really have a firm grasp of why that matters, it does make sense to have a timeline to understand how one event flows from another one. Not just to have a sense of, well, this event happened and that's it, but to have a sense of why this event occurred when it did. Again, timelines become really important in that, and certainly they're important trying to keep everything together in your head. Okay, Donna Jones asks, what was the fate of the 25,000 enslaved persons who reached British lines? I was hoping somebody would ask this question. This is actually one of my favorite things to talk about. So in American history, there are so many moments in it where we talk about a group of people and then we just kind of forget about them after that. And this is an example of that. Generally, we mention Black Americans in the Revolutionary War, we tend to only really focus on either those who were enslaved or those who fought for the Patriot cause. But we tend to downplay or just outright ignore those who actually flee to the British line, some of whom actually fight for Great Britain in the war. And the 25,000 enslaved persons, so many of them obviously don't stay in South Carolina. And in fact, this becomes a sticking point during the Treaty of Paris negotiations, where the Americans are demanding that the British return the enslaved Africans who fled to their lines. And the British simply say, no, we're not going to do that. We are not going to give you back the people you once owned in bondage. Instead, many of those who fled to British lines went to one of several places. Some of them went to Nova Scotia in Canada to live out the rest of their lives. Some of them went to Great Britain itself. They actually ended up in London in the 1780s and 90s. Still others went to Sierra Leone, which was a colony founded by the British in West Africa that was meant to be a reservoir of formerly enslaved people after the Revolutionary War. There are even some accounts we now have of some of these enslaved Africans or formerly enslaved Africans who went to British lines, ending up in Australia, out of all places, later on in the 18th century, because they actually joined some of the earliest voyages to colonize or occupy really Australia in the late 18th century. So to answer your question, Donna, the enslaved persons basically go just about everywhere in the British Atlantic and the British world. Those who go to Nova Scotia, really all of them, they have a very difficult life after the Revolution. Nova Scotia's climate is inhospitable, difficult to farm there. Many of those who make it to Great Britain actually find themselves being, not surprisingly, racially discriminated against by British society. So many of them have difficult lives, but I think if they were here now, they'd say they would much rather have that than continuing to be enslaved. Okay, are you familiar, this is from Baba Derek, are you familiar with a term called Calhounism? If so, what is it? Okay, so this is an interesting question. I can't say I've heard of the term Calhounism. I kind of have a feeling I know what it might mean, but I'm not exactly familiar with the term Calhounism. Barbara Derek, do you know the context of that term? I'm just curious.
Yes. It's centered around his ideas of states' rights.
Okay.
Okay.
That's what I
And it's centered around why you shouldn't secede from the Union. Because if you have states' rights, then you can change your state to anything you want it to be based on states' rights.
Right. Okay. That's what I figured. I will say we're going to get a lot more into John C. Calhoun's ideology in the class section down the road. But so we're going to talk more about John C. Calhoun. But I'm glad you mentioned this because one of the things about this course that you're going to see pretty soon is that folks like Calhoun, Ben Tillman, James Burns, Strom Thurmond, they're all South Carolinians who play a pivotal role on the national stage and really developing ideas that become the heart of what we now think of as conservative ideology. And really, Calhoun is sort of one of the intellectual godfathers of modern conservatism with his stance on states' rights, with his stance on how his brand of states' rights included, as you're going to see pretty soon, essentially nullifying what the federal government says states should be doing, nullifying federal law and the like. So we're going to get much more into that. Do not worry. If you want to learn more about John C. Calhoun, you're in the right place. And I would ask you what's wrong with you, but Calhoun's incredibly important. Okay. This is actually a question for Dr. Gallman. This is from Keitha Whitaker. When was all this history erased? Was it in the 1700s when race was first used to divide white workers from black workers? Or was it earlier?
I suspect it was earlier. I can't give a date, but we know that some of the earliest European philosophers negated the history of African people. And in many cases, it was claimed. So I don't think that was a convention that they said, let's do this. I think that it was a process in which it eventually was eliminated. And I think the whole idea of the laziness of Europeans in needing enslaved people had some of its origins. I know that Christopher Columbus, when he got lost and stumbled onto Hispaniola, one of the things that and I'm paraphrasing, but in one of his communications, he said, these folk are so nice and so kind that we could easily enslave them. He decimated the population. Father Bartholomew de las Casas was, in some historians that I've read, have given him the blame for saying, we really, really love these Indians. They're good people. Let's just go to Africa and enslave the Africans. So to answer your question, I'm not sure, but I'm sure it was earlier than 1700, much earlier. As a matter of fact, it was earlier than 1400 probably. And I know that in 1492, not only did the Moors get driven out of Spain, that was the beginning of the so-called Spanish Inquisition. And the people who were victimized mostly by the Spanish Inquisition were people of color, the Moors, and many of the Jewish people of that time were people of color. I think that was before the so-called Ashkenaz. Actually, I'm not sure when the Khazars actually converted wholesale to Judaism, but that's another story altogether. So to answer your question, it was long before 1700, and I suspect that it was long before 1400.
That is a very fascinating question. And again, I think it's a really important one because these ideas about history and who's important in history go way, way back. Okay, so I see Don Murphy had a question. There were free blacks in Charleston. What percentage of the population were they? So when we're talking about free blacks in Charleston, the numbers suggest that they were roughly, out of the entire black population of the state, roughly 2% of that population. They were a very small percentage. Now within Charleston, the percentage is probably closer to 5 to 10% of the population there, but they are in a really precarious position socially. And we're going to talk about this some more in a couple of class sessions from now, how free people of color in Charleston, the rest of South Carolina, they were in this odd space where they weren't enslaved, but they had very few actual rights in terms of civil rights or political rights or the like. I mean, you don't even think about the right to vote, for instance. Don't even think about having certain privileges under the law, but they were certainly a vibrant part of Charleston's community for many generations. Again, though, they were in a very precarious position because, as you're going to see when we discuss Denmark, DC, for example, they were always under a cloud of suspicion from the white population in Charleston and throughout South Carolina. Okay, Jeannie Hammock has a good question. Did any of the 25,000 enslaved people venture west or to Mexico? That's a really good question. You know, some of them likely did at least try to venture out west. Some would eventually end up in Spanish-held lands like Mexico or Cuba, places like that. You certainly saw that. In fact, during the Revolutionary era, not just the American Revolution, but also the French and Haitian revolutions of the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, you do see a lot of movement by people of color, people of African descent, throughout what we call the Atlantic world. So you have people who may be in Charleston one year, may move to Brazil another year, may end up in West Africa a year after that. That kind of movement was not unheard of. We tend to have this image in our heads in the 18th century, people just staying in place. No, a lot of folks traveled extensively throughout the Atlantic world, often seeking different routes to freedom. Okay, let's see. Okay, any other questions? And there's a really good comment by Dr. Frank Martin in the chat about history and erasure as well. I'm starting to get the sense we might want to do like a special session on history and erasure for the Modjeska School, because this is a really important topic. Any other questions at all? Anybody in the audience? All right then. Well, in that case, Brett, I see you've unmuted. Do you want to add anything?
Well, Dr. Greene, if we've satiated the interest of our people, and I'm just so thrilled that the quality of our educational level with Dr. Gallman and Dr. Greene far exceeds your ability to be able to pay for it, folks. And I just want to say that we're going to have an open mic after we adjourn here, and that Dr. Gallman, can you stay around? Dr. Gallman's nodding yes, and that we can ask some more questions. We will organize a session that Dr. Gallman, at his schedule, will be able to have a further deeper dive and maintain it as something I think the school should do in terms of the history of people before the enslavement. And that we have a whole lot coming up. This Saturday is the first meeting the Progressive Network's had since the pandemic. And so all of you have gotten a notice of that. If you hadn't, let me know, we'll send it again. But on Sunday, we have a really incredible program. This is our first Sunday seminar that we've done for a number of years, that's in sync with the classes that we're doing in school, but open to the public. And we have a woman who has written a new book that's about the rise of capitalism on free markets, the rise of capitalism in colonial South Carolina. It's really this rare thing called new history. How you find new history. This woman's done it. And so it's a tremendous opportunity to hear some new history with on Sunday at 4. And then Monday, speaking about what happened to people that fled, the freed people that fled, that we have for next Monday coming is the opportunity here, that's the 14th, Dr. Catherine Adams, who's specializing in that very thing, talking about the freed slaves that met up with the Indians that were hiding out in the swamps in South Carolina and the Maroons. And so there was a whole pantheon of culture that we need to understand, a resistance that Dr. Adams will bring up next Monday. Dr. Greene, that's my kind of housekeeping details. Turn it back to you for closer.
All right. Well, once again, I want to thank Dr. Gallman for a fantastic presentation this evening. And I want to thank each and every one of you who attended this evening's lectures as well, because again, without the students, there would be no Modjeska School. So again, we have some exciting events coming up this weekend and next Monday. So I hope to see you all there as well. And until then, you guys have a wonderful evening, a good rest of your week. Stay safe out there and keep the faith, everyone.
Oh, when the state steals Medicaid. Oh, when the state steals Medicaid. Oh, I don't want to be in that number. When the state steals Medicaid. When money's out, of politics, with the rich folks beg a trick. Oh, yes, I want to be in that number. When money's out of politics. Yes, we are here to tell the state, our human rights, you may not negate. Oh, yes, I want to be in that number. You know our health care win my way. When we stand up for our fair share, when we stand up for our fair share, well, I want to be in a number. When we stand up for our fair share.